Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean, and today we are talking about the second edition of Trekking the World. And our copy was provided for review, but the thoughts in this video are all our own.
Trekking the World is a 1 to 5 player game designed by Nick Bentley and Charlie Bink. And it has changed quite a bit from the first edition, but the theme is still the same, where you are traveling around the world trying to see as much as you can. Let's look at how it plays.
You start the game with an empty suitcase, an empty wallet, a frequent flyer token, and a trekker ready for globe-trotting adventure. On your turn, you first choose an itinerary card, moving the number of spaces shown, gaining money, and gaining souvenirs to add to your suitcase as long as you end up in the depicted continent. These may also lead to getting helpful tokens. Then you can choose to take an encounter card if you end up on one of the depicted locations, which can give you bonuses or endgame scoring. Or you can pay for a tour if you're in its location, which will gain you big endgame points. The game continues like this until one player completes their 5th tour, or 4 at 4 or 5 players, and then you add up points from your tours, your endgame encounter cards, and the rightmost filled column in your suitcase. And then the greatest trekker is named.
I was quite surprised by this second edition at how much has changed from the first edition, because we've played the first edition on Board Game Arena, and for the first edition, a key part of the first edition is that you're managing your cards. You need your cards to be able to move, you need your cards to be able to trade them in for tours, and that's one of the key aspects. And it's quite light and plays like quite quickly with each turn, but for this new edition, you are no longer even managing cards.
No, that is a huge difference, because in that first one, you basically always have a hand of like 3 to 5-ish cards, and you're thinking about, okay, which one am I going to use to move next turn? Which ones do I need to save? Now you have no cards at all. You're never doing card management. Instead, the cards are above the board, like you just saw in the How to Play, and so now you're thinking about both, like, not just both, 3 things of how far do I want to move, also how much money do I need for things, and then also which continent do I want to be in so that I'm getting those suitcase items. And so there is like immediately a larger decision space. This is not a heavy game or even a midway game. This is still very much a light game, but it is not nearly as light as that original edition.
Yeah, and in terms of getting those souvenir tokens, I think that's another key difference, because before you were collecting them by moving on the board. And so if somebody had been there before, you just couldn't get those color tokens. Whereas now it does factor into what card you're choosing to do for your turn. But another key difference is it's introduced encounter cards. So if you land somewhere and you're somewhere where there's an encounter card, you can take that encounter card and it will give you maybe an ongoing power or maybe like an end game scoring condition. And so it gives you more reasons to visit different places.
Yeah, it does. And also with going back to that suitcase board as well. So it used to really just be you're just trying to fill up those rows. Once you got those tokens, they didn't do anything. But now when you put I think they're called souvenirs, into your suitcase, you sometimes get tokens, and those tokens add even more stuff to the game, where they're helping you fly places, they're doubling your money, they're giving you an extra move later on that is a little bit of mitigation. And so all of that stuff together, it definitely makes this a more interesting game. I think between the two, it's not even particularly close for me. I think this is definitely the more interesting game, but it's quite a bit of a different game, and it kind of brings up, like, I'm interested that this is still even Trekking the World, because this isn't so much like a Great Western Trail where that second edition is more of an art change and there's some slight tweaks. This is much more like kind of a Wormspan compared to Wingspan. Like, this feels like the heart of it is still kind of there. The theme of it is still there, although I guess in that case the theme of it isn't still there. They fly. But the mechanics are changed enough that I think it would have made perfect sense to call this trekking through Europe or trekking the galaxy or trekking through the inside your body, whatever it might have been. I don't think people would have challenged that because it is that much different.
Yeah, it is interesting that they decided to keep it the same game but a second edition. And one of the key things it does is increase replayability. So let's move on to that. So one of the key parts of the replayability is just the puzzle that you're doing, because you're always trying to be able to collect tours. And so just depending on what tours are available is going to be different each game. And it comes with like this massive stack. So it's a quick, light puzzle. But for this edition, they've added a little bit more that does make it feel more different each game.
Yeah, and I think you already touched on one of those key things, which are those expedition, which is just the other side of the tour cards. And I like that they are reusing those tour cards, because that's kind of the fun part of the game, right? Like, you want to see all those different places. You want to go to the Sydney Opera House, and you want to go to Banff. I love that Banff's in this. You want to go to all of those different places around the world. That's the fun part of the game. So now it's nice that there are two different ways to do that, and that second way is adding these different mechanics. So sometimes those are going to get you a thing right now. Sometimes it's going to be an ongoing ability. And I think the most interesting ones are the ones that are going to be the end game scoring, because that is really going to change things up, because it's going to give you a different direction to go in.
And another thing that adds to replayability is the expansion, and that's the bucket list expansion. And what it adds is a bucket list. So it's a list of different places to visit. And if you end your turn at one of those places, you can cross it off the list. And that also gets you a token. So there are 2 new tokens that were added. One of them is, it means you can still get the souvenirs even if you're taking a card from the wrong continent. And the other token means you can take an encounter card if you're in anywhere of the same continent for one of those encounter cards. So I think being able to get more from stopping at places, because the more you cross off, the more points you get, is great. And I think those tokens have added a lot as well.
Yeah, I really do like the crossing off on the list, because I think one of the things kind of maybe a little bit missing from this edition from the first game is the first game, and because it's got those suitcase tokens on the places, gives you another reason to go towards places. But then the other part of this one too is that it's got these personas, or whatever they're called. You've got character cards, and those give you an ability that you're going to have for the whole game.
Yeah, and we have found that that can be a little bit swingy. So there are a couple that seem much stronger than others, and some that seem a bit situational. But it is nice to have a selection, because it just, again, each game feels a little bit different because of who you're playing as. I don't think this is an expansion that you need like right out of the gate. I think you can play Trekking the World, see if it's a game that you like. But if you do like it, then I do recommend it, because it does add another layer that we've really appreciated.
Yeah, I can't imagine, now that we've played with it, I can't imagine playing without it. But let's move on to player count. So like we said, Trekking the World is a 1 to 5 player game. And so let's start out with the multiplayer. And I think pretty much any of those player counts is not going to make it's going to make a bit of a difference. So first of all, it's going to be time, but this is a very quick game. At 2 players, we play this in 30-ish minutes. I can't imagine it going more than an hour, even with 5 new players. Maybe a tiny bit more, like an hour and 2 minutes at most. So don't get to an hour and then yell at me. It may go just a smidge over, but I don't see it going that long. And turns are never going to be all that long, because whilst it has a bit of a decision space, you still have a pretty good sense of, I want to go towards this. I'm just kind of choosing between these 2 or 3 cards. It's never going to be a huge thing. But the big thing that is going to change at those bigger player counts is people rushing to those tours that you want to go to. Even at 2 players, you've gotten really mad at me for this, where you've kind of geared up for one and then I've zipped in and taken it. But at 4 or 5 players, that is going to be something that is going to be happening a lot more. Maybe that's a positive, maybe that's a negative.
Yeah, it is interesting, because I think it might just change how you play the game a little bit, because at 2 players, we save up enough money and then we try and immediately get one of those tour cards. Whereas if you're playing with more players and something that you're aiming for gets taken, you might be able to save quite a bit of money that you might be able to kind of back-to-back get available tour cards, but it means you'll have to change your route and maybe spend a bit longer getting to the right places. So it is just going to feel a little bit different. It's not super mean because you're not stealing something, but you are ruining people's plans a little bit.
Yeah, but I like that in this one you're ruining them a bit less, because in the original, in the first edition, you have to have those specific cards in order to get the tour. So if you've collected up like 3 blue cards and then none of the other tours currently need blue cards, you really feel a little bit shafted. Whereas here, you know, you're left with money. You can spend money on any of the tours. So if I've got $10 that in my head are really going towards this one thing, and then someone else scoops up that thing, it's not a big deal for me to then just change direction, go to another place. I can still use that same money. So that is good about this, is you're not going to mess with people quite as much, but you're still going to mess with them.
Yeah, but it also means that more players, the market of available options will change more, and so that it could be a good thing if more things closer to you open up. There is also a solo mode, and the solo mode works like a timer. So you're flipping cards and you're putting these tourists out on the board, and then if they come up again, you put them on an encounter card, and your goal is to try and get more encounters by the time they've taken, I think, something like 7 encounters.
Yeah, and that one's got different difficulty levels as well, where you have to, it's generally, you need to get tours that are going to cost these different specific dollar amounts. So you got like a bit of a shopping list that you got to get to. And like you said, they're going to just take those off the board and they're going to be collecting them up as you do. But it's not necessarily like an actual kind of bot opponent. It is much more of a timer, but it is more interesting than just a best score mode. So there's a little bit more to it than that. It's not quite the normal game, but it's still a bit of an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and the solo mode was added for this 2nd edition. So let's move on to components. So in terms of components, the board pretty much looks the same as the 1st edition, and I think they've reused the art from the tour cards. And the art is really nice, and you want it to like motivate you to want to visit those places and to do tours. And we've never actually played the 1st edition as a physical copy, but for this one, the suitcase board is double layered, which is great. And now that you're using money, there is a money dial, and I think that does the trick too.
Yeah, I like a money dial or a money track. I don't love messing around with like a whole bunch of coins. It just makes extra components. And so I think the money dial's good. Like, they're nice and tight enough dials, and I think that they do their job well. Also, the storage in this is pretty solid. So one of the kind of knocks of, I think, the 1st edition was the setup was not a huge pain, but you had to take those different souvenir cubes and put them all around the board. Now you don't have to do that. You just have a tray that's got the cubes and the tokens all in that. So setup, very, very simple. And the insert in the box is also good if you're interested in inserts.
Yeah, and the meeples are all differentiated as well. So overall, the components, I think graphic design wise, everything was nice and clear. Once we learned it, we didn't have to revisit anything.
So that brings us to final thoughts. And what we've been saying all the way throughout is, compared to the first one, it does feel like quite a bit of a different game, and it's got quite a bit more going on. So if you've played the first one and you love it, but you think, oh, I wish that there was just a bit more in this, this does do that. So I do think that there are going to be people who have that original game for whom that this is still a worthwhile game.
Yeah, and I think it does a better job of being a gateway game to medium games than the 1st edition, because there are more strategies and just a little bit more under the hood in the decisions that you're making. And so if you haven't played either one and you are looking for a gateway game that will work for new gamers, but also for gamers who have a bit of experience, or that you're also playing with experienced gamers that don't want something that feels a little bit on rails, I think this does have just that step up from the 1st edition.
I can also see this working as a family game, because I can see kids, it says on the box 10 plus. I know when I was like 7, 8, I loved this game called Globetrotters that was about traveling the world, and I could see 8-year-old me getting really into this game too. The one thing, it's just a bit weird to me that this is a 2nd edition, because it's such a different game. It feels like, I don't know, I just have questions about why it wasn't trekking through somewhere else, and then just like the next game in the series.
Yeah, it is interesting that they made this a 2nd edition, and it would be interesting to see what the people who have and played the 1st edition feel about this one.
And that is it. Have you played Trekking the World, either the second edition or the first edition, or both editions? We'd love to know your thoughts. And are there any other traveling around the world games that you might recommend?
Thank you so much for watching. As usual, please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.